Okay, whenever you're ready.
All right. Today is November 16th, 2015. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be interviewing Hugh Wilson for the Archive of American Television and the Writers Guild Foundation. And we are here at the Writers Guild Library in Los Angeles, California.
Cut.
All right.
Okay. No, okay.
Ready when you are.
All right. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Hugh.
Thanks for having me.
So we'd like to take a few minutes to just get some background information.
Sure.
So what was your name at birth?
Hugh Hamilton Wilson, Jr.
And when and where were you born?
August 21st, 1943, Victoria Hospital, Miami, Florida.
And did you grow up in Miami as well?
I did till the 7th grade, and then we moved to a bedroom community of Miami, Coral Gables, where the University of Miami is. I grew up and went to Coral Gables High.
What were your parents' names and what did they do for a living?
My dad was Hugh Hamilton Wilson Sr., and he was a surveyor. And my mom, Frances Nugent Wilson, was a housewife.
Do you have any siblings?
No.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
I think my father had a really nice, gentle sense of humor, and my mother had kind of a saber-like sense of humor, and maybe a mix of those two.
Tell us a little bit more about that saber.
The saber?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, I don't know. She, oh man, this is all of a sudden very personal. She was often pretty critical, and sometimes quite funny about it. And but my dad was more. He didn't have that much to say, but he would just leave me laughing like crazy. And the other thing is that we lived across the street from Joe and Barry Levin, and their parents. We were Irish Catholic, and they were Jewish. And at a very early age, I remember saying to my mother, "You know, I think the Levins are a lot funnier than us." So I don't know. Maybe that had some impact on me. Certainly Miami wasn't a typical Southern town. My parents were Southerners, but after World War II, there were so many people from the Northeast and then later from the Midwest. I think I recall once maybe being one of 4 kids in my 3rd grade class, let's say, who had been born in Miami. It's kind of like L.A., I would think. It was just a place people went to rather than came from.
Right. What were some of your interests when you were little?
Pretty typical stuff. As I got older, I became very, very interested in sports and Little League Baseball. Matter of fact, John Grisham and I made a movie about Little League Baseball. We both had such a wonderful experience doing it. And I loved football. I was always at the Miami Boys Club playing sports, some basketball, but we were mainly football and baseball. And then it was kind of a blow to me when I didn't have a growth spurt when I got to high school. I only weighed in the 10th grade about 113 pounds, so I couldn't play football. And the truth of the matter is I was never a very good baseball player. I just loved being out there. So that was the end of my sporting career, but I am a devout viewer of sports.
Did that start when you were young?
Oh, yeah. Well, we didn't have a TV till we were 7, but I remember begging my father to take me to University of Miami games and to like the Orange Bowl and stuff. He could care less, but he would do it for me.
So you got a TV when you were 7, you said?
Yeah, I was in the 2nd grade. I couldn't believe it. I raced home, and there it was in our living room. We before that had to go down to the Sonny McDonald's house. They had the first television in the neighborhood, and it was Kukla Fran and Ollie was a huge hit, after school hit, and there'd be sometimes 14 boys and girls in their living room. And then finally, other families began to get TV sets, and it was just fascinating. The old joke is people would watch a test pattern. It was just so cool. Mm-hmm. And then I appeared on television because there was Skip or somebody with the silly hat and the puppet in Miami who would have the Cub Scouts and kids, be his live audience. That was my first experience with television.
So what was that like for you?
Well, I certainly remember it. It stuck out as a very salient thing that was happening in my life. I think that TV would be like what the computer was to my kids, or the car was to my dad. Mm-hmm. Those were the big inventions of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any aspirations of being involved with television at that age?
No, I didn't. I have to, with lack of humility, say that I was always considered a very funny guy among my classmates. And I appeared in variety shows in high school, but I would dare not go near the drama club because they were considered a bunch of really strange people that were not popular. So I would just do variety things and stuff like that. When I got to college, I thought I was going to go to law school. I lived with a couple of law students, realized almost instantly that wasn't for me. And about that time, the idea of going to Hollywood or New York it was beyond my wildest dreams. But about that time, commercials started being really funny and cool. Volkswagen, Alka-Seltzer, and they were kind of cooler than the shows. And I thought to myself, maybe I could get into advertising. I could do that. So in fact, when I graduated from the University of Florida, I went up to New York and tried to get in the advertising business, which I was not successful at. They always had receptionists on the ground floor to keep me out. I was a perfect description of, and by the way, I had no contacts or anything, and I think the ad agencies, the madmen of that day, it was kind of a clubby, Ivy League-ish kind of, better have gone to Dartmouth than the University of Florida, better have known people in New York than not know a soul in New York, and that was going on. But advertising, but it was changing. A lot of guys that had never been near an Ivy League school, and women the same way, Italians and Greeks and Irish, all that, they were coming in and doing some fantastic graphics and television and radio and print stuff. And it was a real creative explosion at the time. And it was a pretty hip thing to be in advertising.
So when it didn't work out in New York, what did you do next?
Well, I finally found a job. I met a recruiter who was with the Armstrong Cork Company, which used to be one of the biggest corporations in the United States. Because they dealt in asbestos, they've since been sued down to a nub of what they used to be. They were gigantic, and I met their recruiter in New York City in a bar, I think, and he told me what he was doing. I told him what I was doing. He invited me down, and I got a job in their in-house advertising department and moved to just at the edge of the world. It was called Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's mostly Amish country and very rural, and there is this huge company there, and this would be 1965, and we had to wear a hat, snap-brim hat, and an overcoat, and a suit to work, and they had just begun to allow powder blue and yellow shirts with a tie, no sport coats. And the funniest thing in the world was me buying a hat. I'd never had anything with a ball cap, So that was Armstrong, but it gave me my start because they did this thing where they brought all their salesmen from their various departments, ceiling, floor, industrial, adhesives, whatever. They would bring them into Lancaster for their yearly sales meetings. And there's not a whole lot to do there. And what we would do is put on live shows for the salesmen to introduce the new products for that year. And they would have the Armstrong Circle Theater, which was a big show on television when I was a kid. By the time I got there, they were sponsoring, they would buy parts of shows. Now it's all spot buys, but companies would buy, it would be Death Valley Days brought to you by, and Armstrong was still doing that, and so we'd have stars come in. I remember Sally Fields I think because Armstrong was paying for some of I think Flying Nun thing, and so we'd have stars come in, but then we would literally put on shows for the salesmen in which we had hired singers and dancers from the Broadway stage in New York to come down, and we would take the lyrics of songs like On a Clear Day You Can See Forever and change them to On a Clear Day You Can Sell Forever. Well, it was pretty pitiful, but on the other hand, it was all very professional, and that's where I met I see their names on a plaque here at the Writers Guild, Tom Patchett and Jay Tarsis. Jay had gone to Williams, Patchett had gone to Michigan State. Jay had tried to make it on the Broadway stage as an actor. He was married and had a very young baby, who, by the way, later became head of ABC programming. He needed work. Patchett was just married. So they came down to work at Armstrong really because of their stage and drama backgrounds. And that's how we all met. And after about a year, about the time I was really I got to get the hell out of here. I wanted to go to Atlanta, which is kind of the Paris of the South, if you went. And I was going to go down there and get in the advertising business. But before that happened, Tom and Jay put together a two-man comedy act, which they'd try out at parties and whatnot. And then they started getting booked in nightclubs in the area, and the Foreign Legion Club, whatever. And I would go with them, kind of as their technical man, which was to run the lights and try to start the laughing, and I'd go and hopefully get everybody else in it. But they went on to attempt a career in comedy. I split for Atlanta and went to work for an advertising agency down there called Burton Campbell, a very strong regional advertising agency, which before I left after 10 years there was Burton Campbell Wilson. And I became a partner in that as the creative director and eventually president of that agency. And I used Tom and Jay in a lot of commercials, and we stayed in touch. And they continued on, and they were playing famous places like Mr. Kelly's in Chicago and upstairs at the Downstairs in New York, but it was still a struggle. And at that time, a rather famous manager who we all miss very much, died a couple of years ago, Bernie Brolstein, who's represented some of the biggest names in show business. He saw their act somewhere on the East Coast, I think in Philadelphia, and he brought them to Hollywood, but not as a comedy team. He suggested they focus on writing. So back in those days, we would have summer replacement shows. Carol Burnett would go off, and there would be the Buddy Greco summer replacement thing. And they started writing on that. And through their work there, they were very fortunate. Bernie got them on the Carol Burnett show. And if you wrote for Carol Burnett, you automatically won an Emmy. You know, and they both did. Then they wanted to do sitcom, get out of Variety, and they were hired by Grant Tinker, who is running Mary Tyler Moore Productions, to come in and show run and produce the Bob Newhart Show. This is the Newhart Show where he was the psychologist in Chicago. And they were in, I think, their third season of doing that. I had come out to LA to direct a television commercial, and I actually stayed at Jay's house, and I told him I didn't want to be in the advertising business anymore, and that I thought I could be a television comedy writer. And so Jay got me a meeting with Grant Tinker, and which was really a lucky, huge seminal event in my life. And so I went up, and Grant was extremely kind, as he always was, and cordial. And all I had was my sample reel of commercials, many of which were very funny. And he watched it, and he said, "Yeah, this is great, but you know, I don't know how it translates into what we're doing here. Be you a writer or a director, this 3-camera thing is a very specialized deal, and I'm not sure it works, so we'll keep you in mind." And I said, "Well, do you have any kind of opening anywhere?" And he said, "Not for a guy who's president of an advertising agency." He said, "I've got a thing where we're going to hire somebody from USC to be a gopher, and we're going to try to get him into our director training program." And I said, "Well, I would like that job." And he said, "Well, it pays $200 a month. No, $200 a week." I said, "I want it. I want it." And I took it. I was recently divorced and had a little child in Atlanta. My former wife, who remains one of my dearest friends, she said, "Well, we'll stop the alimony until if you can just do child support." And my wife of 40 years, who I then met, she came out, and I started at MTM in this gopher thing, but I was like 30 years old, and so when I'd go up and ask Alan Burns and Jim Brooks what they wanted from the deli, they all said, "You're too old to get sandwiches." And so just a wonderful thing opened up for me. I could go down to the Mary set, for instance, where, by the way, which gave me goosebumps just seeing the set, the empty set, because back in Atlanta, the bars were empty on Friday nights because everybody went home to watch all the lineup of those big comedies. Right. So it was a mind bender to even see that. But I got to sit up in the stands and watch how the week progressed on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I watched the readings. Then I could see Jay beginning to block out the show. Then I saw the writers come down and look at really rough rehearsal, the show barely on its feet. And then I was absolutely amazed by the rewrites that went on. The writers would go back, and they would be there till, I don't know, God knows how late. Well, I found out how late later. And then the next day, oftentimes there'd be almost a whole new script. The actors made no attempt to memorize anything because they knew everything was in play and completely in flux. By Wednesday night, the script was pretty much in place, and Thursday was a technical day, and then Friday was rehearsal and shoot. And I was able to they didn't even know who I was down there. I think finally somebody said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, And says, boy, where are you from? You want to be a comedy writer or Southerner? I'm not sure that works. And then I finally got a script assignment, again, through the mercy of Tom and Jay, Tarsus and Patchett, to write a Newhart show. And I tried to write a spec when everybody said, you know what, you better stick to directing. But I'd been able to watch the show for a while and all that. And I wrote a script and they said, pretty good. And so I wrote another one, and I sort of became an unofficial writer on the Newhart show. And that was so much fun. I went down there and again, nobody introduced me. And I would just kind of sit in the back. And finally, this man came up to me and said, hi, my name's Bob Newhart. Who are you? And I said, I'm Hugh Wilson. He said, oh, hi, Hugh. What is it you're doing here? And, I'd like to introduce you to the rest of the cast members. That's the kind of guy he was. And it was a wonderful bunch of people. And that's where I started writing. And I sold a number of scripts. I think I sold 6 scripts in about 6 or 7 months. So the sandwich stuff was over with in a big hurry.
So tell us a little bit about learning to write scripts. Did Jay and Tom help you with format and structure, or how did you kind of pick that up?
Well, I've read, you've got a bunch of examples of scripts, and I read them and I understood the structure of them, and but what I didn't understand is the I know formula is a word that people don't like to say, but there was a real formula to it. Like if you watch the Mary Show or Bob Show, what there were 3 scenes, commercial, 3 scenes, and a tag. And those scenes should be about 6 to 8 pages. They would time out. A 30-minute show was in fact 23 minutes, such. If the first scene was in Mary's house, then the second scene would be in the office, and the third scene would be back in the house. Then it would go office, house, office. And there was this underlying foundation that I pretty quickly caught on to. But if you didn't know that, you'd write a script and they'd say, oh, this idiot's got 2 office scenes back to back. And so that was the general, now, I don't think Lear shows work the same way. A lot of times, like Archie Bunker was all house. It was very rarely they left the house. And I also noticed there was a complete tonal difference in MTM and Lear, and they were the two. It was like the Harvard and Yale of comedy at the time. And the Lear shows were shot on videotape. They were loud. People were pissed, The MTM shows were shot on 35 millimeter film with a care for lighting. Sometimes, although it's very difficult to do any kind of lighting with a 3-camera event because you've got it. But the whole tone was a little different. We were, I thought, maybe a little classier, but not nearly as edgy as they were. My mother's generation liked Mary a lot more than some of the Lear stuff. And Lear was very prideful of the fact that his shows could get to be, could bother people. That was part of his game, and ours wasn't. That was the MTM thing. And in fact, when I created WKRP, well, to back up here, after Newhart, I went and worked 2 seasons on the Tony Randall Show. The Tony Randall Show was, after that, not a success in the ratings. But that's where Tom and Jay created the show. They hired me. There were the 3 of us, and then they hired Gary Goldberg, who had written some spec scripts they liked. And so we were the 4 writers on that. The second year, Tom and Jay left to create another show. And it did not, I think it ran for 6 episodes, and I can't remember the name of it. But it meant that Goldberg and I were kind of the head writers on the Randall show. And the one thing I couldn't abide was them coming in very late in the game and rewriting all the work we had done the week before. So not so much out of ego, but just out of keeping the thing from going crazy. I finally told them, you can't do that. You know, you got to give us your notes very early, and then you really got to let us drive the car. And they were very good about that. And the other thing that was absolutely super about that was working with Tony Randall, who was a vast library of show business information. And I was such a such a hick in a way. As a matter of fact, the first show I directed was a Tony Randall show, and Randall took me off to the side when I was working. He said, "Hugh, first of all, we don't practice, we rehearse. You practice sports, you rehearse shows, okay? You keep saying, let's practice that again, not good." That's number one. And the other thing is, I've heard you misuse this word several times. There is no English word such as theater. That's not a word, okay? So you gotta learn those two things, and I think you're on your way. So he was very nice. But he taught me things like, there was this smart alecky thing that we writers all love to say, not at all original. If an actor said, what is my motivation really for entering the scene at this point? Why am I coming in? What draws me in? And they would say, your motivation's your salary. And at first I thought, that's cute. And then I thought, that's really wrong. That's BS. And Randall was one of those. And so he said, that's what good writing is. You have to motivate. You can't just plop a character into a scene. You yourself have to invent it, even if it's subtextual. You have to do all this. And a 3-camera show done in front of a live audience is very much like putting on a play, a short play. And so, you see blocking. I would see directors, for instance, who would, they needed a 2-shot, and a character is standing here, and they need to get this character over here, and they just walk him over. I mean, you'd get into, as you're making a gross exaggeration of it, they would say, well, when he pulls his knife on you, I'm going to need for you to step closer to him for the shot. Of course, no one steps closer to someone with a knife, and the poor actor would say, I don't get it, because the director was just interested in his camera composition, right? That's all you guys think about it. So it was wonderful working with Randall. And then one day, Grant Tinker, who is, as you probably know from everybody else, was an absolute prince, who, by the way, left all of us from Jim Brooks, the greatest of all the MTM writers, Alan, all of us, all the way down. I didn't know it because it was my only Hollywood experience, but I was living in a fool's paradise. I had no idea how sharp the elbows were and how annoying the networks were and all, because somehow Grant, he had so much success. He just kind of kept his people safe. And he also had a huge respect for writers, more so than actors. I mean, he almost felt like I could replace that particular actor, but I can't replace that team of writers. But the fact that the writing was good meant that all the actors were happy. And they were pretty happy sets all over the lot. And I thought that's how life worked. I found out shortly that it wasn't always that pleasant. But one day on the Randall set, Grant came through, and it was just this casual. He said, hey, any of you have an idea for a show, a new show we'd make a pilot of? And Gary Goldberg, I should say he's Gary David Goldberg. Well, the first time we saw his name in the credits, we said, "Oh, you're like Henry David Thoreau." Huh? We just beat him up on that. But I think the reason for that is there was already somebody in the Guild called Gary Goldberg, I think. So that's why the Gary David. And boy, we really beat him up for that one. Anyway, Grant came through and said, anybody have any ideas? And so after that, I went home, and I had an apartment in the Hollywood Hills at the time, and sat down with my wife, and I said, you know what, a radio station would be good. I was been in the advertising business in Atlanta, and I knew a lot, and I loved to write radio commercials, because you didn't need a big budget to do a bang-up job. In television, if you didn't have the money, you were really in trouble. But in the radio, you could buy a sound effect for $30. And so I loved that, and I knew a lot of the radio people. So I came up with the WKRP in Cincinnati thing, and I flew back to Atlanta, and I spent about a week at WQXI in Atlanta, and just hung around because I wanted the show to be authentic in the eyes of people who worked in radio stations. And it all was, except I wanted turntables, and by then they were using cassettes. But that was really my only concession to not trying to be very realistic. But I knew these characters. Skinny Bobby Harper was the morning man at QXI. He was a friend of mine. He'd be leaving the bar when I'd be coming into it, because he had to go home to go to bed, you know. And he was a wonderful guy, and so Dr. Johnny Fever kind of became him. My friend Clark Brown was going around in polyester suits selling radio time. He became Herb Tarlick. There was no Lonnie Anderson, her character Jennifer Marlowe. That was a complete, I think I've said in the past, it's probably true, that Bailey Quarters kind of reminded me of my wife, who is ambitious but in a shy way. Certainly, Mr. Carlson, the guy that ran the place, was based on a previous boss of mine that'll go unnamed. So they were all based on people that I knew. And I think what also helped was that when I took the show to CBS, the idea, sort of a scenario of it, first of all, I was seated next to Grant Tinker, who just had so much clout. That was so important. But the other thing was, it was a blessing for me I hadn't counted on, is almost all of the people at CBS who picked and chose what shows had a background in radio, and it was kind of warm to their hearts. So I think that really helped.
Do you remember anyone from CBS who was in the room for that pitch?
You know, I do, but I can't remember their names.
That's fine.
I'm sorry.
No. So, but Grant was
God
on.
bless him, I'll say that, and shame on me for not recalling
No.
their names. But it's been a long time, and also I was very nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I've got this idea.
It's your first time pitching.
Yeah.
Did Grant run through it with you at all beforehand, or did you do a practice run? You just went in and did it?
No. Well, in fact, in the ad business, I'd been in so many pitches that were so much harder that's when I realized that if you hit the ball out of the park in Atlanta, you get $30 for it. If you hit it out of the park in LA, you get $3,000. I thought it was just as hard to hit, but I was just playing for a lot more money and a lot bigger audience. I really never took into my head how big an audience we were dealing with. It just was too theoretical for me. And when I looked at the rating numbers, I didn't quite extrapolate anything. I just looked at whether we were third or 35th. And I think that was good because I was not nervous. Mm-hmm. And all I ever wanted to do was conquer that live audience. I figured if I win them over, and I don't have to use a laugh machine, which is the holy grail among us, to stay away from that damn thing. If you won the live audience over, then it was probably going to work for the rest of the country. So we did the pilot for WKRP, and I cast that. CBS wanted Gary Sandy in the lead, but I cast the rest of the show primarily with people who were not very well known, but that I had seen and liked. And then when we shot it, we were over at the old Columbia lot because we were the first MTM show on videotape.
Why is that?
And the reason for that was there was a meeting, a music meeting, and the idea was that when they played records at WKRP, they'd be what's called sound-alikes. It would sound like the Beatles, but it wouldn't be the Beatles. And I said, then we really can't do this show. We really must stop right here. That's not good. We got to play real records. They said, oh, well, that's going to cost money. And I said, no, we got to do that. And so we looked into it, and actually I could buy what was called a needle down, where maybe I could get 17 seconds of Pink Floyd for $3,000. And if I use like two pops like that, that's $6,000. My cast wasn't making a lot of money. I wasn't either at the time, you know. I mean, we were blessed, don't get me wrong, but not crazy money. And that came a little later, but I was able to get these real records on, and I think it made the show. And in fact, there came a time in our second or third year, there was a strike, a Writers Guild strike, as I recall. And so when we went back on the air, we were literally shooting shows that were going to be on in like 10 days or 12 days. It was that tight. And by then, the record companies were treating WKRP as if we were like a radio station. Guys were showing up and giving me, you know, they brought in, you know, some stand-up poster. Well, I'd take it down and put it on the set, you know, and then the band would see, oh my God, we're on, you know. I was doing product placement just for the hell of it, bands that I like. So I started getting all this stuff, and in fact, we actually broke some records on KRP. It was the first time they were heard.
Which ones did you break? Do you recall?
I don't know. Tim Reed knows. Because by then, I was letting Howard pick the old kind of rock and roll Pink Floyd stuff, and Tim was picking the Commodores and all the kind of black rhythm and blues and all. The station in general was anti-disco. As a matter of fact, we made fun of disco every time we got a chance. But they were really picking it, and some records were heard first on KRP. But we, you know, groups like Journey, we couldn't afford the Stones or the Beatles or Michael Jackson, but we had everybody else. And this became a huge financial problem years later because the show was just going great guns in syndication. And I was getting a lovely check every August, which made me feel like I think I'll leave LA and go live on a farm in Virginia with my lovely children. And then the rights to the music had to be renewed, and that $3,000 needle down now, they wanted $103,000 for it. So that was the end of WKRP syndication. But I can't say I would have done it any other way. But suddenly we just disappeared.
Did you ever think about having actual rock groups come on at all?
No, I should have done that. Well, we had fake rock groups. We had one show with an English group called Scum of the Earth.
They were actual musicians were in the group, right?
Yeah. And then I have to tell you, back in the day, they would bring out all the affiliates from all over the country, And they brought them to the CBS studio where we were at Radford, and they would come on these buses, and they would have the very famous restaurants cater their dinners and the sound stages and all of that. And two writers from WKRP, our offices were just where the buses were going to arrive, had taken this banner that we had from the set that said "Welcome Scum," and hung it out the windows of our office. And suddenly 3 or 4 ushers from CBS came up there almost running and hysterical and all that, and got it down. But that "Welcome Scum" thing got to be kind of legendary among us band of chuckle writers.
Mm-hmm. So there were actually 2 DVD releases of WKRP in Cincinnati. Were there music issues again when those were released?
Yeah. So the first one, 20th Century Fox acquired the MTM library. I think they were the 3rd owner. And they decided that they could make money selling the first season. But they had Lonnie and Howard and Tim and me. We went to New York, went on the Today Show, did a bunch of interviews afterwards, but I could tell DJs were calling in. We were doing these interviews that would then be live on various radio stations, and they said, "Hey, Hugh, you know how badly these shows have been cut up?" And I said, "Not really, I hadn't looked." And they said, "It's a mess." So I knew it wasn't going to sell, and it didn't. And so 20th Century didn't go on with the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th year. I was very disappointed because I shared in the profits of these things. And also I loved the show, but in that order. Anyway, when the Shout Factory, they were able to keep most of the original music because their negotiation wasn't to play it on a cable or network. It was just on CDs. And these guys also at the Shout Factory are old music guys, and they knew how to make contracts, and they were interested. At 20th Century, nobody really wanted to put any effort into it. So God bless the Shout Factory. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that arranged for us to be honored at the Television Academy, where I saw cast members, some of whom I hadn't seen since 1990.
This was just a few years ago?
Huh?
Just a few years ago?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it was 2 years ago, I think, that summer before last that they had that. And it was wonderful. I had such a good time.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about the making of the show. You shot the pilot. How did the show debut? Did it debut to good ratings, do you recall?
No, I don't think KRP did. I think our ratings were disappointing. In fact, after a couple of shows, we were taken off the air to be worked on. I don't know what the work on deal was about. We all just sat around. And then we went on in a different time slot, and we did better. We had terrible time slot trouble the 4 years that it was on. When we had good time slots, we were top 10. But we couldn't make our own way in a bad time slot. And for a long time, we were on against Monday Night Football, which was much bigger than it is today, as big as it is today. And then I remember telling the live audience, I did the warm-up. You usually hire a stand-up comic. I didn't like that because they didn't know anything about the show, and they just kind of do their own act. So I did the warm-up, and it was all about the cast. And I would bring out actors that weren't in the next scene, and we'd do a two-hander or something like that. But I remember saying that we were on against Little House on the Prairie, and they were a very tough group because every time their ratings dropped, they'd blind another child. And that was my big joke that I used later to gauge whether we have a good audience or not. Because you have great audiences when people are in town for vacation, and then around Christmas, the only people in the audience are the agents, or, and you'd have to tell the actors you can't go by this audience because they're just sort of here because they represent you, and it's just, you can't get a proper reading from that. Anyhow, our ratings were not good. We did a Thanksgiving show that got a lot of talk and press called Turkeys Away, and that was good.
Tell us a little bit about that one.
Well, Jerry Blum, who is the general manager of WQXI, told me that he had been fired from a Texas station for throwing turkeys out of a helicopter. And I said to Jerry, "You just won me an Emmy." That's really funny. And so that was based on a true story. And it was just hilarious. It was just as funny as it could be. And I think what it did is that we were getting very good write-ups from the critics and the reviewers, who counted maybe a little more then than they do now. I don't know. Now everything is out, word of mouth on the internet. But, a bad review in Variety was not good. But we were getting really good reviews and had a nice little buzz about us. And even though we didn't have big numbers, I think the combination of being a show that they were rather proud of, being a show that was at MTM, who had a lot of clout, they stuck with us. And we stumbled through 4 years. Then they had a chance to, a new guy, Harvey Shepard, came in at CBS, who I think was a new broom wanting to sweep clean. And he decided to get rid of us and keep Alice, Kiss My Grits, Alice. She just infuriated me. And no, I don't want to say anything mean about anybody else, but they weren't in our class. I didn't think. Harvey canceled us, and then I was so delighted. The show went into syndication and just took off.
Why do you think it was so successful in syndication?
I think because people had heard about it and heard that they liked it and couldn't find it because we had had 15 time slots in 4 years. I think people felt like they hadn't seen it before, but they had heard good things about it. And I was delighted too because, Harvey's a very good fellow, I'm sure, but it really proved that he had made a dastardly stupid decision. And it did better in syndication, I believe this is true, than all the MTM shows, including Hill Street and Mary and Rhoda and Phyllis and et cetera, et cetera. Wow. But we were kind of an after-the-fact hit.
Let's talk a little bit about the cast and the writing. So you talked about casting. Let's talk a little bit about working with the cast. So talk a little bit about Gary Sandy as Andy Travis.
Wonderful, wonderful guy, dear friend. He came through Charlottesville, Virginia last summer and visited with us. Gary had an energy about him, and he would move around the set almost at a trot, and I told him that heroes never hurry. And that was the biggest gripe he and I had, because he was full of energy and he would move, and I don't know where I got that, but I knew that I'd never seen John Wayne rush over, and he was, playing that guy. The others, Lonnie Anderson had never done comedy. She was rock solid. I never had to rewrite a line for Lonnie. She just was great. She wouldn't let me, sometimes I went too far. I had her say one time, bring me the head of Farrah Fawcett Major, and she said, "Are you mad? Have you lost your mind? I'm not going to say that on television." She was really right, but she was awfully good. And you know, I'll tell you the other thing is after they do about 3 shows, they're sort of following my lead. The writing is telling them what to do, and then they inhabit the part, and now they become that character, and the writers chase them. There's a nice little switch there.
Let's talk a little bit about Gordon Jump. Let's wait for the siren to pass for a second. All right, Gordon Jump, who played the big guy, Mr. Carlson.
One of the nicest men that ever lived. Great, great guy. Very funny. He was big, comedically big, and my tendency is usually to say a little less big, but I only did that a couple of times with Gordon. And Gordon, sometimes, Gordon was the adult on board. He was the oldest of the actors and of the writers. And I think sometimes he would just say, let's stop. There would be some altercations and arguments. And I had a terrible time getting people to come to work on time. I bought them all Timex watches once. And the problem with that is, and it happens on all the sets, is that if you're supposed to, well, I'll tell you, on the movie I directed, First Wives Club, if you call the actors to the sets and it's 7:30 in the morning, and Goldie Hawn shows up and Diane comes on time and no Bette Midler, after about 15 minutes, Diane and Goldie are thinking, whoa, she's not a bigger star than we are. Screw it. And they go back to their trailers, and in walks Bette Midler saying, where is everybody? And I said, well, they left because you were late. And she was like, well, fuck them. And so now she's back in her trailer. And we've been there for an hour and a half and haven't shot any film yet. That's what I meant about everybody being on time, because if you're late, you're kind of saying, well, I'm more important than you are. And we had a very kind of, we had a lot of equality on our set. We actually didn't kind of have a lead. Gary was happy that the thing was becoming a gang comedy. Do you mind if I drink some water?
Oh, please.
I don't know how to open it.
Oh, you just pop it.
Oh, wait, you twist it.
You pop the top.
Got
There it
it? There we go. Oh. All right. So we'll just talk about a few more cast members here.
Okay.
Frank Bonner as Herb Tarlick.
Frank Bonner is another man I just love. He's such a good guy. And he was great at Herb, and he and Richard, they were the glue.
Richard Sanders.
Richard Sanders. I mean, Lonnie was getting all the magazine covers, and Howard was even getting write-ups in Rolling Stone, and he was invited to host Saturday Night Live. But it was Herb and Les that were the most dysfunctional and therefore funniest characters. And they were just beauts to write for. I loved them to death. And then the problem was everybody said, wow, what a cast, and they're all going to have big careers. But, like Frank told me later, he said everybody wants a Herb Tarlick-like guy, but they don't want Herb Tarlick. That happens to a lot of character actors. He later went on and directed quite a few sitcoms, and he was good. I let a lot of the actors direct KRP. Tim Reed directed one. Frank directed, no, Tim directed more than one. Frank directed. I think Howard directed.
And Tim Reed and Richard Sanders also wrote a couple episodes.
He did.
They? Yeah.
Yeah. I should tell you that when you see who wrote, like the KRP or really any of the MTM shows, that was the starting blueprint. And then it would be rewritten, usually pretty heavily. Just the nature of the beast. If it's one camera, there's no changes. You shoot what's on the page. This was like trying to fix a play. We couldn't fix it in editing, but we could fix it before we shot it. So there was a lot of changing scene, and by the end, it was kind of a gang-written thing. And then there was always the final filter, which was the head writer. And I dare say, I would think, although a lot of people would be involved in a show, it would finally get down to just one pencil. I'm not bragging about myself. I'm telling you, that's how it invariably worked. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, Richard did, I don't think he wanted to write another one because so much of his stuff got tossed. It was kind of a bruising business. I always thought sitcoms were a great life for actors. They come in at 10 and go home at 6, craft services, and they get an hour off for lunch. One camera is a brutal business to be in, but 3 cameras just. However, for the writers, you'd see cars going out of there at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning from rewrites. And
well, tell us a little bit about the atmosphere in the writer's room on WKRP.
Well, I tell you, the way it started for me on Newhart, watching Tom and Jay and various writers on that, and I kind of sat as an observer. And to tell you the truth, I had some ideas, but I was afraid to pitch them because it can be kind of brutally embarrassing in that environment. Where they say, okay, guys, this line here with Bob, he's saying this, that's not any good. Any suggestions, and somebody say, oh, well, you could say, hey, well, blah, 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 and they'd go, any good suggestions? And of course, you'd be humiliated. So my idea was to say nothing. I mean, even if I had a killer joke, I'd take Jay off to the side later and whisper it to him. And also, there was a stenographer there who was making script changes. And it was invariably a secretary and who worked for the head writer. And if somebody pitched a line and the writer looked at the lady with the pencil and went like that, it was in. If he didn't look at her, people just kept pitching. What I did that was different is on WKRP, I had all the writers come in on Wednesday, fix everybody a drink, and take all their notes. They'd just been down to see a run-through. And then I said good night. And then I stayed in and rewrote the final script. I didn't like that bruising, looking at the secretary thing. It also got me home sooner.
What did you look for when you hired writers?
Well, I had a couple of writers from Second City, so I thought they were good, and they were very funny people. I hired one guy because he had been the station manager of a rock and roll station here in LA. I got him really just for his radio expertise, although he went on to write comedy. I hired my secretary, Liz 11, who had come down. She graduated from Berkeley, and she had been in all these meetings, and she said, I'd like to write, and she wrote a spec script, so I hired her. I kind of did it that way. Of course, you're always looking for really good writers. It's kind of a bad thing happened in my early years at MTM. They used to accept spec scripts, and then we were all told not to do that anymore. The reason being, people would send a spec script, I'll just make this up, but it'll show you how it worked, where Bob got hit by an ambulance or something. and it would be a terrible script, and we would read them, you know, but you know, if it wasn't good by the third page, just have a letter go back saying thanks for your interest. Well, suddenly people were sending in lawyers taking depositions saying you stole the Bob gets hit by an ambulance idea. And so they just said no more spec scripts. So it became, it was like Gary Goldberg. He just kind of mailed these things in, and then his wife, who knew Tom and Jay, gave them to him. But I mean, that kind of thing sort of stopped, and it was really too bad, because I know of several writers who have just been hired from, hi, you're in Cleveland, Ohio, you've sent us 2 scripts, a MASH script, we think it's great, come on down and we'll allow you to write one of our shows. Or at least have your name on the show. It was always written by the head writer.
You mentioned you enjoyed writing for Herb and Les. Were they your favorites to write for? Or did you have a favorite to write for?
Herb and Les, and I like the big guy too. Yeah. You know, Venus Flytrap was pretty real. And Dr. Fever was kind of real. And it's just easier to write for... it's just easier to write for funny characters. And oftentimes the lead in a sitcom is stuck with the worst job because they're the serious, they're kind of the the center of the wheel, and those around them may be going completely nuts, but they have to play it straight. Mary was the straight man.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between Herb and Jennifer.
Well, Herb's reaction to Jennifer was what I thought all boys would be thinking. And she was always kind to him, but always big stop sign. And of course, he was hilarious in his frustrations.
All right, we're going to take a short break and then we'll pick up again.
Oh, thanks. I'm sick of hearing me.
You're not. How you doing?
I'm okay.
Is this fun for
Am I
you?
getting hoarser and hoarser?
No,
That's
not at
great.
all.
You're unrelenting.
I
I
gotta
thought
be.
you were going to say thanks, Hugh. You
I
can
gotta
go
be.
now.
Oh God, we got a lot more.
Are you guys okay?